Probably those of you who've been on these calls have heard me say quite a few times that the thing that gives me hope in this moment of real horror is just all of the young people that I have met and the talent and courage that I see. And that's true for Jewish students, and it's true for Palestinian students and students of all different backgrounds. And I also know there are extraordinarily talented Palestinian students at Columbia. One in particular who I was hoping might be part of this interview. Unfortunately, I think the pressure on Palestinian students is so extreme that I think it is harder, in my experience, for Palestinian students in this moment of extreme peril to speak publicly, and maybe a little bit easier for Jewish students. But one of the students who I've had the good fortune to get to know a little bit over the last couple of years, given that I don't live too far from Columbia, is Aharon Dardik, who's joining us today. Aharon, as he'll talk about, grew up in the Bay Area and then in the Israeli settlement of Gush Etzion in the West Bank. His father is an Orthodox rabbi. He was a conscientious objector from the Israeli military, and then went to Columbia, where he will be a rising senior, and was the founder after October 7th of Columbia Jews for Ceasefire. And I think the last time I saw you in person, you were chained to a gate on Broadway, if I remember correctly, in protest of Columbia's complicity in the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So Aaron, let's just start at the beginning of your story. Tell me a little bit about your family.
I love my family. When I was born, the first thing that my parents did was my dad had a bottle of Israeli water from May Eden, and he put a little bit of it in my mouth. So the first thing I tasted was from the land of Israel.
Huh.
So growing up, the connection, both from a Jewish cultural perspective and sort of a Zionist community, and also I knew the eventual destination and point for my family, the place where we were supposed to settle down and then live forever, was Israel. And that was happening at some point during my childhood. It ended up happening in 2014. My entire family moved to the West Bank settlement, and I went from a Jewish day school in Oakland, California, to finishing up middle school in Gush Etzion in Efrat. And from there, going to Sanhedria, an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in West Jerusalem, to do high school at a religious Zionist yeshiva high school. There, the sort of boundaries for what was in and outside of debate were shifted rightwards from what I noticed even at Zionist spaces back in Oakland. There was a really big dismissal, was one of the first things I encountered, of a sort of liberal Zionism that was part of the structure of really mainstream American Zionism.
This is once you were in Israel, you mean?
Yeah. The idea that a two-state solution was ultimately what we were hoping for, but was impossible because of the Palestinians. When I expressed things like that after I moved, my friends and even authority figures in my life were like, you made it, you're here. You don't need to say that anymore. We're talking about how Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria, not the West Bank, will be eventually incorporated as part of Israel. It was obviously spoken about as if it already was part of Israel, especially in the settlements. And the boundaries for what it meant to be Jewish, to be Israeli, and to be supportive of Israel were all shifted in a way that seemed a lot starker and clearer in some ways, and also caught me deeply off guard, because while I was used to these elaborate justifications and reasonings behind why Israel was basically for my whole life, right, since 2009, under a right-wing government and taking actions in that direction, there was no need to say oh, well, even though we are progressive, we still support Israel, because being progressive was not on the table, right? The second worst insult that you would come across in high school was homo, that you were gay, and the worst one was smolani, that you were left-wing. So in that environment was when I really started having to confront for the first time, oh, I think that there are some questions that I at least have with the ideology and with the environment, both religiously and politically, that I'm growing up in, that I'm surrounded by. And at the time, in some ways with a bit of naivete, and in some ways with an attitude that I'm really trying to keep to this day, I thought to myself, well, if everyone in my community is doing this, it's probably right. And if it's right, then I don't have to be afraid of doing research. I don't have to be afraid of other arguments where there are things that could challenge me or make me feel like I should doubt what I'm doing, because even those doubts will be healthy, because eventually I'll just end up back where I started, because what my community is doing is correct and fine and good. And if I'm wrong about that, I would rather face those uncomfortable truths, but then actually know it's right, as opposed to avoid those and be consistently living in denial. And that's sort of how my political journey started on Zionism.
Yeah, your story reminds me of something that Simone Zimmerman has said, a kind of slightly similar version of this about when she was a pro-Israel activist at UC Berkeley, and she was involved in these debates over, I think it was over divestment. And she said they were getting materials from national pro-Israel organizations, and she was frustrated because the stuff wasn't convincing. And she said, send me the good stuff. It was like she was sure that it was there, but she just was waiting for someone to give her that stuff. I'm curious why you think it was that you had these questions to begin with. Was it because the discourse in Oakland was different? So your Americanism primed you to see things from a different perspective and to have questions, or within particularly your family, or something just about you personally?
It's a really good question. It's something I've wondered a lot, because part of this process was watching a lot of my friends who were in somewhat similar situations, just go on radically different paths, especially my friends from high school, some of whom ended up having very similar journeys, but most of whom did not. And I think that there are some things, like I'm very appreciative that my family is one that has always celebrated intellectual curiosity. I definitely think that the same way that we talk about being bilingual opens up different ways that you can see the world, because you can see it through a new language. Having sort of the multicultural background of being in the United States and then coming to Israel was helpful for me to be able to see that there are just multiple ways that one can have a perspective on a given issue. I think that there's also something that in some ways is my like personality and the way that I try and go about things, but in some ways I think it's very universal when nurtured. It's just that I think everyone has an innate sense of curiosity and a desire to really know what's out there in the world and really be able to appreciate it and really see it. And that is sometimes tempered with fear to try and pull back because something knowing that could be dangerous. But I really think that it's within everyone's capacity to let their curiosity and their courage guide them to really finding out what's out there in the world. And I don't think that comes sort of as a fatalistic thing about circumstances of one's birth. I think it's a decision that people make when they wake up every day.
And so once you started to feel like you wanted to investigate more, to question or perhaps to validate the things that you were hearing in your community, how did you go about doing that? What were some of the things that you read or, conversations you had that began to make you think differently?
A lot of my conversations sort of followed this like pattern where either I would observe something happening on the ground in my community, either at school, in the settlement. I remember pretty vividly the first Yom Ha'atzmaut ceremony that we had, where in addition to eating Israeli or Mediterranean food and like a flag ceremony where we waved Israeli flags and had an elaborate dance about that, that there was this montage where tanks and combat soldiers, it looked like something that I associated more with video games like Call of Duty than something that would be appreciated in real life as something to aspire to. And seeing that and seeing the militarism, I was like, whoa, we don't want to do this. We're doing this reluctantly. Why is this being reified and admired? And so I'd have all these moments like that that would trip me up. And I would go on the internet and I would find places, whether it was in Facebook comments or in Discord servers or wherever it may be, connecting with people who were in these sort of debate and skeptic communities, the people who like talking about these things. Not always people who were very smart, but just people who had different perspectives.
And you were in high school at this time.
I was in high school at this time.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I was curious and excited just to be able to basically pit what for me were Hasbara talking points against what they had to say on these issues. and asking them questions and trying to hear them out. And if I ever came across something that I didn't know the answer to, I would basically write down the argument word for word and then go to an authority figure in my life, whether it was my parents or my teachers, and ask them, hey, what do you think about this? And if they would give me a response that was satisfying for me, I would then take that back to the internet forums I was on. And if they didn't, I was like, yeah, like sort of like what you're saying with Simone Zimmerman, like give me the good stuff. And this process sort of continued, and incrementally I found myself drifting much more from right-wing settler Zionism to a very like solid liberal Zionism, and then further and further until the breaking point for me was when Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem and the Palestinians to the March of Return in Gaza, a protest that was very largely peaceful, that was not a threat to Israel or Israelis at all, that was like what I thought at the time, quote unquote, Israel was waiting for, which was just a legal, peaceful protest that they could say, look, this is how Palestinians should be engaging in resistance. But instead, they were met with live fire. And something close to 200 Palestinians died in the March of Return. And I was super on the ball at every single point where Palestinians were getting closer to the border fence, where they were throwing things or rolling tires. And none of that seemed to justify the really, really violent response from a country that had, like snipers trained on the entire area. And that was sort of the moment where I realized, like, oh, I don't have confidence that not just like the current people in government, but the broader system of Israeli Zionist politics is interested in any form of Palestinian resistance. And that the only kind of response that Palestinians are supposed to have, if they want freedom, if they want a state, is complete surrender.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.